Hi, everyone. My name is Dylan Nicholson. I'm with Lasso Loop Recycling. And essentially what we're doing is we're introducing a new way to recycle that's based on purity and traceability. To solve the problems of recycling, what we need to do is to decentralize it. No different than we're seeing it across other industries. We need to put recycling at the forefront of where it needs to happen. And that's exactly where human beings put two or more materials into the same bin. We're seeing all kinds of innovation happen on the back end of recycling. And to really solve the problem, we have to flip it on its head and we have to make it be about purity from the start. Here are a few of my colleagues. Aldous Hicks, he's the original founder. He has 30 years of experience in materials handling and mining. Phil Sanders, our CTO, he comes to us from the appliance industry. He's been building appliances, leading the R&D department for Electrolux, which is the world's one of the world's largest appliance manufacturers. And Dominique Leonard, she's leading our marketing and growth. I will speak to some of the metrics that her and her team have been able to achieve in the last year. And Dr. Yannick Verbielen joins us from the UK, where he is a professor of electrical engineering. He's doing all of our embedded software systems, making the hardware and software work well together. So as we all know, recycling is a problem. Over 90% of Americans claim that they recycle, they enjoy recycling. And yet, despite billions and billions of dollars in subsidies and non-compete government contracts, about 80% of what you put into your blue bin actually goes to waste. But behind this slide is what the recycling industry today produces. And it's mountains of valueless materials. Unfortunately, it's going to continue to do so because the unit economics of recycling are cost prohibitive. And when you look at a graph or diagram like this, there's no question of why. Each one of these red touch points represents not only a cost, but also CO2 emissions. And the problem here is that there's no way to track or trace these materials through the post-consumer supply chain. We have these diagrams built out. If you're interested, please feel free to shoot me an email. But we have these diagrams built out for glass and for plastic, for metals as well. And the process is no different. However, if you were to decentralize recycling and able to process these materials in the comfort of a home or anywhere that humans put two materials in the same bin, you create all kinds of value. Number one, you're able to streamline the process, get rid of all kinds of inefficiencies. We estimate that's about 6 times more efficient to recycle this way as compared to the current system. We're also able to track and trace the materials throughout the supply chain, so we can return things like carbon offset credits back to the consumer. We can reward consumers, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. But basically, think of the technology as an appliance. It's about the size of a dishwasher with a microwave on top of it, and it has a few different chambers. The first chamber is a sensor chamber. Then we have a wash box to clean and dry the material. We remove the label. And then it goes into one of our 3 processors. So there's a plastic granulator, metal shredder, and a glass crusher. From there, it's further subdivided by material type and color, where you'll pop out the bottom of the appliance. It's about the size of a suitcase on wheels, roll it to your curb, and be collected by either ourselves or one of our on-demand collection partners. We do have patents worldwide on this appliance. And there's also a huge B2B element here. Every company on Earth is coming out with their net zero target. Oftentimes they're pushing those targets back, and there's no reason, and there's no wonder why. You have your typical family, they purchase these products from CPGs around the world, they throw them into the blue bin to feel good.
1 minute warning.
We wind up with low recycling rates, incomplete data, and unrecoverable scope 3 emissions. If we flip recycling on its head, like I mentioned, we create all kinds of value on both sides of the table. On one hand, we can go to these CPGs and provide them with a data set that no one else can provide. We can go back to the Coca-Colas of the world and say, hey, we know when Matt likes to drink Coca-Cola, or we know when Jake wants to have, a bottle of wine. So we can go back to them and reward their consumers, or provide a way for them to reward their consumers for reducing their scope 3 emissions and creating closed loop products with materials that they've already produced. And then on the other hand, consumers get all kinds of benefits. They can receive rewards from fast moving consumer good companies. They'll receive a take rate on the product sales themselves. And They get to reduce their scope 3 emissions, because at the end of the day, this is a system that actually recycles.
And your time is up. A system that recycles, a totally different way of thinking about recycling. I know I talked to Jake previously, and I see a lot of interesting. The reason I was so interested in it is because I kind of hate it and feel like it's wrong, and that's not the right way to do it. And yet somehow the numbers still work out in a pretty interesting way for making recycling larger scale and higher opt-in, so to speak, or higher utility. Where? Brian, there you are. I was having trouble finding you for some reason. You wanna kick things off, Jake?
Yeah, sure. So I think in the circularity space, what's really interesting from a generic startup point of view, so forgive me guys, this is less of a question, more of a musing morphing into a question, is that consumer attitudes need to change. You can see that in the UK, one of the biggest grocers ended a trial with a reusable packaging solution because it said consumers weren't there yet, which is ironic because the whole lean startup ethos is meeting customers and consumers where they're at. So on the one hand, I totally see how this works. You know, you're taking existing packaging solutions, you're providing a recycling outlet. There's still the question as to whether people want a relatively large appliance in their home for that. So I think that would be the first question. But then to just add a second one on that, on the same theme, recycling's an answer, but I think the jury's out as to whether it's the best answer. Because from a CPG point of view, it's still very difficult. They can't mandate customers treat waste in a certain way. And so we're seeing an increasing number of them move to reuse rather than recycling, whereby there's a reverse logistics element to their offering. So I'm curious how you think about Lasso, the long-term, medium-term, et cetera, of recycling versus reuse and how you play into that. And then that first question around how you guys how are consumers from your kind of initial traction, wait lists, etc., how comfortable are they about having this relatively large appliance in their home where previously they probably had a slightly smaller bin or an under sink bin, trash can, etc.?
Yeah, great questions. I'll try to answer both quickly. So I like to think about 20 years into the future and let's work our way back. 20 years from now, we're going to be installing these appliances in any place that human beings put 2 or more materials into the same bin. We're going to do it with no upfront cost to anyone, and we're going to finance it based off of the materials that are processed. Now, obviously, we can't start 20 years in the future. So what we do need to start with are the altruistic eco warriors, the folks that bought the first Teslas, the people that bought the first consumer solar before it necessarily had an ROI. To really lead the charge. And that's where we've had our most traction. We have over 5,000 reservation holders. We've already done a pre-sale campaign back in February as well. And we'll be rolling this out in a land and expand model where we'll focus on San Francisco, LA, maybe New York, Austin, Texas, in a sequential manner, so that we can prove out the number one, the return on not only CO2 emissions, but also the share of the product sales, and then also prove out the back-end logistics system as well. Now, this is just the entry point though, because this is going to replace, the waste management collection services of apartment buildings, of hotels, restaurants, schools, any situation where human beings put 2 or more materials into the same bin. We're creating the problem that is recycling today. To riff on your point about the ethos and playing into reuse versus recycling, you're totally right. If you look on our Instagram, we are prolific in trying to share and educate people on reuse strategies, on reduction strategies, on refusal strategies. But holistically, if we look at recycling as a global problem, which is exactly what it is, the developing world is going to be 30 to 50 years out from being able to catch up to get off of plastic, for example. So if we can decentralize recycling in Africa, if we can decentralize recycling in low-income communities across the world, we're going to be able to create tremendous value, not just for the people who make the right decision to recycle, but for the planet as a whole.
Cool, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I like that decentralizing recycling, so thanks.
One follow-up question on that: to decentralize recycling in the developing world, how cheap of a price point are you going to need, though?
Absolutely. That will come. You're totally right. And it'll be financed by the materials that are processed. I mean, just for example, if you take 1 ton of PET plastic out of a landfill, you're going to pay about $240 a ton. If you have pure PET flakes, that value goes up to around $2,000 to $2,400 a ton. So you're almost 10xing the value of material by not having to go through all those steps in the diagram. So yeah, we're definitely going to have a price point that's accessible, but the value of the materials goes up tremendously, and then we'll be able to finance it.
So just to jump in there about the product itself.
Sure.
Just curious why you chose, and when it was developed and kind of the go-to-market strategy was for direct to consumer as a starting point versus going to, businesses that have influence on what they're like, a lot of different companies and corporate entities are looking to reduce their carbon intensity on their operations, and just by a function of any which way they can do it. So putting this into, even into just like their office, or to other things where you're going to have a higher amount of essentially end raw material because of the amount of people that are going to be throwing things in there, and getting, because that's almost like a forced, forced people's perspectives and to be utilizing this if it's like at their office, or as you said, like a school or other things like there. And then also just from getting to a certain level of cost on the materials that you're going to be paying back, the volume certainly is going to be a lot higher at those more centralized points. So just curious to why you started with the consumer versus saying go to a business first to have something.
Yeah, great question. We went where the market was willing to pay. The direct-to-consumer model, we've already pre-sold these appliances. We did an equity crowdfunding campaign back in 2019 with the direct-to-consumer model. They were the folks that supported us, so that was very much kind of the wind behind our sails, if you will. And we are working on a multifamily apartment building unit as well as a bar and restaurant application, because you're totally right. The volume is there, but the crux of what we're doing though is really making recycling be based on purity instead of it being based on volume. So we have to get it immediately at the entry point in order for this system to work. Otherwise, we're just putting everything into the same bin and then trying to separate it out again. So the application is obviously very different for a co-working studio, if you will, or an apartment building. It's going to be a much larger unit. I spent a few weeks out in London this summer, and I saw the writing on the wall that this has to be a large unit outside of council block homes where kids can walk up with their phone, ding who they are by a QR code, and load it up with their family's recycling and receive instant rewards. So like that's the application on a grander scale. But yeah, right now we're starting with the high net worth individuals that understand recycling is a problem. They're willing to pay for it, so we can prove that this model works.
I actually want to double click there because, Brian, that was a brilliant idea. I think malls, cafeterias, schools, corporates are the go-to for this. You have so much more volume, and they are willing to look at things from a business perspective and say, this makes me money. Yes, it takes time, but there's an ROI. And it also makes me look good to my employees, or it makes our mall look good, or it's a new type of vending machine that gets put in that makes more money for the mall or for the school, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and to riff on what you guys are saying, what we've been working on is a financing vehicle in order to be able to finance those higher price point devices, to go to the schools, to be able to go to the bars and restaurants and say, we can install this for free. It's going to be $500 a month to handle all of your recycling. We can collect it on the front end. So that's really the next big inflection point for us. And then obviously following that will be government subsidies, no different than an EV or consumer solar tax credit.
Yeah, I mean, even depending on the adoption, say if you went to a business or a larger type of organization and you have people involved in it, especially on the corporate side, having, I almost look like there's potential for to entice with incentives to their employees, saying that we'll get a rebate versus like, some there's some companies that do like, a stipend for certain types of activities that become their employees are more sustainable, like having, a bike or electric type of mobility solution or something. They give the employees that. And I've been seeing more and more of those type of activities from corporate entities that are looking to get their employee base more sustainable. And so, again, it kind of goes back to where I saw this as a good avenue is on the kind of this on a B2B sales point to then get to the consumer. But I can understand from where you're getting from your funding sources to get off the ground to get there, it's chicken egg.
Yep. And we're working at it on all fronts. I mean, this is like I said, it's a global problem. We need to have an application for Asia. We need to have an application for Europe, and those are going to be very different machines. But yeah, we're really excited to tackle this from a decentralized perspective.
Just at it, do you have? And I don't know if it was in your deck. Just quickly, do you have estimations on what a potential payback period would look like for this type of application, with like what you would expect for the input materials to kind of what's coming back? And also, I would say, excluding maybe the carbon or green credit piece, because it's still in its infancy and it's hard to gauge on what that is.
Yeah. So for a typical family of 4, based off normal consumption habits, you're looking at about a $600 a year return, and that's with us also capturing revenue. But it's a $600 a year return back to the family. And at a $3,500 price point, this device pays itself off in 3 to 5 years at launch, with no financing, with no hardware as a service model, which is considerably ahead, a solar comparison.
Got it. Thank you.
My question for you would be, what's the progress? What's happened since we last talked, and what is happening in the next month or two that has you excited, and why?
Oh man, I can't say. I can't share what's exciting, but you'll definitely see it in the press in the next month or so. But we do have some very exciting partnerships, both on the government side as well as the B2B side, where you guys are all alluding to. So we're excited to share those here in the next 2 weeks, hopefully. And yeah, in terms of that, we've also landed a partnership with Trash Warrior. They do on-demand collection for recycling, very much in line with what we're doing, so we can double down on their back-end logistics. And then, yeah, the government and the big CPG partnership will be announced shortly.
Very good, very good. And my last question for you would be, how big can this get?
Sky's the limit. I mean, this is a $4.5 trillion market opportunity by 2030. That's from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. If we can introduce circularity and stop pillaging the planet to produce petrochemical-based plastics and reuse the plastics we've already made, we're going to have a tremendous benefit on keeping plastics out of our ocean, keeping valuable materials out of our landfill, and stop burning up materials as a waste to energy recycling plant. So it's a very exciting problem to be tackling, and as you guys can see, it's a massive one.
It is a massive one. There's way too much that gets thrown out. It's basically everything in your garbage is some type of food packaging. If you go look in your garbage, anyone who's at home, it's hideous. It's terrible, and that's why recycling's a big deal.